Good afternoon, class. I hope you are well. Good morning or good evening. I don't know where you are. I keep saying the same thing. Anyway, wherever you are, I hope you are well. This morning, because it is 11:47 a.m. here in Michigan, in the United States, the time is 11:47. So good morning. This morning we will cover chapter 2 that deals with the international monetary system. So let's get started. This is the chapter overview. We will begin with the evolution of the international monetary system, and we will work our way down to the distinction between fixed and flexible exchange rate regimes. Now, let's begin with the evolution of the international monetary system. The international monetary system went through several distinct stages of evolution, summarized as follows. First, we have the bimetallism. That was a system in place before 1875. Then we have the classical gold standard. We have the interwar period. We have the Bretton Woods system. And finally, we have the exchange rate regime, which has been in place since 1973. Now, what was bimetallism? Again, remember, this was the system in place before 1875. Bimetallism was a double standard in the sense that free coinage was maintained for both gold and silver. Countries on the bimetallic standard often experience the well-known referred to as Gresham's law. Gresham's law dictates that under the bimetallic standard, the abundant metal was used as money, while the scarce metal was driven out of circulation because the ratio of the two metals was officially fixed or set. Now let's turn our attention to the classical gold standard, which was in place from 1875 until 1914. Okay. First, full-fledged gold standard, a monetary system in which currencies are defined in terms of their gold content. That's very important. Was established in 1821 in Great Britain. A majority of countries moved away from gold in 1914 when World War I began. Under the gold standard, the exchange rate between any two currencies was determined by the gold contents. Now let's go over an example, a very simple example of the classical gold standard. Now suppose that the pound is pegged to gold at 6 pounds per ounce, whereas 1 ounce of gold is worth 12 francs. That is, it will cost 6 pounds to purchase 1 pound of gold, and it will cost 12 French francs to purchase the same ounce of gold. Deducing from the information given above, 6 pounds must equal 12 French francs, so that the exchange rate between the pound and the franc should then be 2 francs per pound. Now, under the classical gold standard, there was a mechanism in place known as the price specie flow mechanism. Now, price specie flow mechanism was an automatic correction of payment imbalance between the countries operating under the gold standard, based on the fact that domestic money stock rises or falls as the country experiences inflows or outflows of gold. There were, however, some shortcomings. associated with the classical gold standard. The supply of newly minted gold was so restricted that the growth of world trade and investment could be seriously hampered for lack of sufficient monetary reserves. No mechanism was in place to compel each major country to abide by the rules of the game. So this opened up the possibility of cheating by some countries. Now, what about the interwar period? This regime lasted from 1916 up until 1944. World War I ended the classical gold standard in August 1914. Major countries followed the sterilization of gold policy. Countries widely use predatory depreciations of their currencies as a means of gaining advantages in the world export market. This period was characterized by economic nationalism, half-hearted attempts and failure to restore the gold standard, economic and political instabilities, bank failures, and panicky flights of capital across borders, across national borders. Then came the Bretton Woods system, which was in place from 1945 to 1972, named for a July 1944 meeting of 44 nations at Bretton Woods in New Hampshire. Okay. The purpose of the meeting was to discuss and design the post-war international monetary system, that is, the Bretton Woods system. Under the Bretton Woods system, each country established a par value in relation to the US dollar, which was pegged at $35 per ounce of gold. Each country was then responsible for maintaining its exchange rate within plus or minus 1% of the adopted par value by either selling or buying foreign exchanges as needed. However, a member country with a fundamental disequilibrium may be allowed to make a change in the par value of its currency. Now, under the Bretton Woods system, the US dollar was the only currency that was fully convertible to gold. Other currencies or other countries held US dollars as well as gold for use as an international means of payment. The Bretton Woods system was described as a dollar-based gold exchange standard because of the arrangement described above. Now, during this regime, a paradox known as the Traffin paradox came to exist. A Traffin paradox explains the collapse of the system in the early 1970s. What does the paradox suggest? Well, it suggests that the reserve currency country, in this case the US, should always run a balance of payments deficit, thereby supplying the dollar to the rest of the world, but this can decrease confidence in the reserve currency, in this case the dollar, and lead to the downfall of the system. Finally, we have the flexible exchange rate regime, which has been in place since 1973. The flexible exchange rate regime was ratified in January 1976 when the International Monetary Fund members met in Jamaica and agreed to a new set of rules referred to as the Jamaica Agreement. Under this regime, the flexible exchange rates were declared acceptable to the International Monetary Fund's members. Central banks could intervene in exchange markets to iron out unwarranted volatilities. Gold was officially abandoned or demonetized as an international reserve asset. Non-oil exporting countries and less developed countries were given greater access to international monetary funds. And here we're looking at the trade weighted value of the US dollar since 1964. Okay. You can see that right before the collapse of Bretton Woods, the trade weighted value of the US dollar was fairly stable. Then with the collapse of Bretton Woods, we can see a lot of volatility. This went on until the mid-80s when Reagan was president of the United States. The dollar had risen so much that the International Monetary Fund members got together and decided that the dollar should be pushed down. Okay? And from that point on, the dollar began to decrease in value until the same member countries arrived at the conclusion that the dollar had fallen too far. And at that point, they started to intervene in the market in order to push the value of the dollar up. Now, currently there are different exchange rate arrangements depending on which country one is looking at. One, no separate legal tender. That is, there are countries in which the currencies of a foreign nation or foreign nations are used. Okay? Here, the currency of another country circulates as the sole legal tender. That is the case of Ecuador, El Salvador, and Panama, where the US dollar is the currency in circulation. In other words, these countries do not have their own sovereign currencies. Currency board is another exchange rate regime. This is an extreme form of the fixed exchange rate regime under which the local currency is fully backed by the US dollar or another chosen standard currency. Okay. Here we're looking at places like Hong Kong, Bulgaria, and Brunei. Then we have the conventional peg. A country formally pegs its currency to a fixed rate to another currency or basket of currencies. That's the case of Mali, Jordan, Morocco, and a few other countries. Then we have the stabilized arrangement. Yeah. Here, the stabilized arrangement entails a spot market exchange rate that remains within a margin of 2% for 6 months or more. Yeah. That's the regime in place in Indonesia, Singapore, and Lebanon. We have the crawling peg, which involves the confirmation of the country's authorities de jure exchange rate arrangement. Here we're thinking of Honduras and Nicaragua. Then we have the crawl-like arrangement. Here, the exchange rate must remain within a narrow margin of 2% relative to a statistically identified trend for 6 months or more. Examples are Iran, China, and Serbia. Then we have the pegged exchange rate with horizontal band. Here, the value of the currency is maintained within a certain margins of a fluctuation of at least plus or minus 1% around a fixed central rate, or the margin between the maximum and minimum value of the exchange rate exceeds 2%. That is the case of the small country of Tonga. We have other managed arrangement. This is a residual category used when the exchange rate arrangement does not meet the criteria of any of the other categories. So we think in Algeria, Cambodia, and the Sudan. Then we have the floating exchange rate regime. Here, exchange rates are largely market determined without an ascertainable or predictable path for the rate. Okay? That's the case for these countries: Brazil, Korea, South Africa, Thailand, and so on and so forth. And then finally, we have the free floating exchange rate regime. Okay? Here, intervention occurs only exceptionally and aims to address disorderly market conditions. Monetary authorities confirm intervention has been limited to at most 3 instances in the previous 6 months, each lasting no more than 3 business days. Now, those countries in which free floating exists, those countries are Australia, Canada, Mexico, Japan, and so on and so forth, the US, the Eurozone. Now, let's talk a little bit about the European monetary system. Now, the chief goals of the European monetary system, or EMS, are the following: to establish a zone of monetary stability in Europe, to coordinate exchange rate policies vis-à-vis the non-EMS currencies, to pave the way for the eventual European Monetary Union. In trying to achieve those goals, 2 main instruments are utilized, and those instruments are the European Currency Unit and the exchange rate mechanism. Now, 11 of 15 European Union countries adopted a common currency known as the euro on January 1st, 1999. Now, the European Monetary Union was created. Okay? This gave rise to the creation of the European Monetary Union. Each national currency of the Euro 11 countries was irrevocably fixed to the euro at a conversion rate as of January 1st, 1999. Here it says conversation, but it should have been a conversion. Now, euro notes and coins were introduced into circulation on January 1st, 2002, while national bills and coins were being gradually withdrawn, and the changeover was completed by July 1st, 2002. Here we're looking at the evolution of the dollar-euro exchange rate. Okay, we see significant gyrations. And here we're looking at the dollar-euro exchange rate changes. Here we see even more volatility. Now let's provide a brief history of the euro. The monetary policy of the Eurozone countries is currently conducted by the European Central Bank, which is located in Frankfurt, in Germany. The primary objective is to maintain price stability. Independence, its independence is legally guaranteed. That is the independence of the bank. Okay. The euro system is made up of the European Central Bank and the central banks of Eurozone countries. Okay. Tasks include defining and implementing common monetary policy of the Union, conducting foreign exchange operations, holding and managing official foreign reserves of Euro member states. These are some of the responsibilities of the European Central Bank. What are the benefits and costs of the monetary union? There are key benefits, namely reduce transaction costs, the elimination of exchange rate uncertainty, enhance efficiency and competitiveness of the European economy, conditions conducive to the development of continental capital markets with depth and liquidity comparable to those of the United States. Political cooperation and peace in Europe. Now, the main cause is the loss of the national monetary and exchange rate policy independence. Now, the world has witnessed several currency crises, and here are just a few. Three major currency crises revealed the fragility of the international monetary system: the Mexican peso, 1994 to 1995, the Asian currency crisis, 97-98, and the Argentine peso crisis. So let's take a brief look at each and every one of them, beginning with the Mexican peso crisis. Now, on December 20th, 1994, the Mexican government announced a plan to devalue the peso against the dollar by 14%. This decision caused the pesos, as well as Mexican stocks and bonds, to be sold rapidly. By early January 1995, the peso had fallen against the US dollar by as much as 40%, forcing the Mexican government to float the peso. The peso crisis rapidly spilled over to other Latin American and Asian financial markets. This is what we call contagion. And then you can see on this graph the US dollar versus Mexican peso exchange rate from November 1st, 1994 to January 31st, 1995. You can see that the peso was fairly stable. That exchange rate was fairly stable. Okay, until again November of 1994, when the Mexican peso began to drop rather dramatically. Now, the Mexican peso crisis is unique in that it represents the first serious international financial crisis touched off by cross-border flights of portfolio capital. Now, two significant lessons emerge from the Mexican peso crisis. And those are, first, it is essential to have a multinational safety net in place in order to safeguard the world financial system from such crises. And two, Mexico excessively dependent on foreign portfolio capital to finance economic development, when a higher priority should have been placed on saving domestically. Those are the two main lessons. Now let's turn our attention to the Asian currency crisis. Far more serious than the crisis of the European monetary system and the Mexican peso in terms of the extent of the contagion and the severity of the resultant economic and social costs. That is, the Asian currency crisis was much more severe than these two here. Okay. Many firms with foreign currency bonds were forced into bankruptcy. The Asian currency crisis led to an unprecedentedly deep, widespread, and long-lasting recession in East Asia, a region that had enjoyed the most rapidly growing economy in the world over the last few decades. Okay, once again, you can see the evolution of a few currencies in Asia, the Thai baht, the Korean won, and the Indonesian rupiah. You can see the free fall of those currencies during the Asian currency crisis. Now, one important question to ask and hopefully answer is, what are the origins of the Asian currency crisis? Well, as capital markets were opened, large inflows of private capital resulted in a credit boom in the Asian countries. Fixed or stable exchange rates also encourage unhedged financial transactions and excessive risk taking by both borrowers and lenders. The real exchange rate rose, which led to a slowdown in export growth. Also, Japan's long-lasting recession and the depreciation of the yen hurt neighboring countries. If the Asian currencies had been allowed to depreciate in real terms, which was of course not possible because of the fixed exchange rate regimes in place, the sudden and catastrophic changes in exchange rates observed in 1997 might have been avoided. Eventually, though, something had to give, as is always the case. It was the Thai baht. The sudden collapse of the Thai baht touched off a panicky flight of capital from other Asian countries. What are the lessons learned from the Asian currency crisis? Well, a fixed but adjustable exchange rate is problematic in the face of integrated international financial markets, as this invites a speculative attack at the time of financial vulnerability. Now, the incompatible trinity suggests that it is very difficult, if not impossible, to have all three conditions. That is, if you cannot have a condition in which a fixed exchange rate exists, free international flows of capital exist, and the monetary policy it can be conducted independently. These three are difficult to coexist at the same time. Now, what about the Argentine peso crisis? Well, in February 1991, the Argentine government passed the convertibility law, linking the peso to the US dollar at parity. That is, one peso was set equal to one US dollar. Now, the initial economic effects were mostly positive. Argentina's chronic inflation was curtailed dramatically, and foreign investment began to pour in, leading to a significant economic boom. The Argentine peso appreciated against most currencies as the US dollar became increasingly stronger in the second half of the 1990s. A strong peso hurt exports from Argentina and caused a protracted economic downturn that led to the abandonment of the peso-dollar parity in January 2002. This change in turn caused severe and significant economic and political distress in the country. In fact, the unemployment rate rose above 20%. Inflation reached a monthly rate of 20%. This was simply devastating. You can see the collapse of the currency board arrangement in Argentina up until January 17, 2002. Again, 1 peso was said equal to $1. But then once that policy was changed in 2002, you can see how the dollar significantly appreciated against the Argentina peso. There are at least 3 factors that are related to the collapse of the currency board arrangement and the ensuing economic crisis. First, there was a lack of fiscal discipline. Okay? The labor market was very inflexible, and then there was contagion from the financial crisis in Brazil and Russia. All of these events have contributed to the Argentine peso crisis. Now we make a detour here to talk a little bit about the Chinese renminbi. Now, China has recently become one of the top trading partners in the world. GDP is second only to the US among individual countries, but its currency, the renminbi, has not achieved a similar international prominence. China's currency has the potential to become a global currency. We need to meet a few critical conditions. A full convertibility of its currency is one condition that China must meet. Open capital markets with debt and liquidity should also be encouraged. The rule of law and protection of property rights should also be fostered and encouraged. Here we sort of compare fixed and flexible exchange rate regimes, their arguments against and for. Arguments in favor of flexible exchange rates include easier external adjustment, national policy autonomy. Now, arguments against the flexible exchange rates are exchange rate uncertainty may hamper international trade and investment, and there are no safeguards in place to prevent crisis. A good or ideal international monetary system should provide at least the following 3 things: liquidity, adjustment, and confidence. By liquidity, what do we mean? That is, a good international monetary system should be able to provide the world economy with sufficient monetary reserves to support the growth of international trade and investment. A good international monetary system must also provide an effective mechanism that restores the balance of payments equilibrium whenever it is disturbed. And finally, a good or ideal international monetary system should offer a safeguard to prevent a crisis of confidence in the system that result in panicked flights from one reserve asset to another. My dear friends, in a nutshell, that is a summary of chapter 2. Remember that I chose my words very carefully. I said a summary. Okay. In addition to listening to these lecture recordings, you are encouraged. You are also encouraged to read the material in your textbook. Okay, that being said, I wish you well until I'm able to come to you again. Thanks.